All right, welcome back to part 2 of our RPA training, and this is the new RPA that was released in December 2020. And we're starting off today on page, let's see, we are on page number 7 now, so let me just get the 7 here. And from our last one, last training, as we roll over to page 7, the first item on top is items excluded from the sale. What's really important about that is there's been a lot of discussion since the last version of the RPA about what is actually considered attached to the property, right? What's considered a fixture. And what's big on this one here is to notice that furniture and other items that are secured to the property for earthquake or safety purposes are not considered attached, right? So if I have a bookcase and I have a bracket on it to keep it from tipping over, that is not going to be considered attached to the property, so I can remove the bracket, take the bookcase with me. Also, one of the bigger differences, the brackets or the mounts that hold up flat screen TVs are no longer considered attached to the property, so the TV goes, the mount, the bracket goes, right? And then any of the damage that's done to the wall where the screws were in, those holes are simply just fixed, they're filled in. So it says right here that the holes and other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So that's the first part there. Now we'll move on to paragraph 10, which is the allocation of costs. And I think the most important thing about all of this in this section here is that word allocation. What does that really mean, right? So when you're asking for a pest report or a septic report or a roof report, and you're asking the seller to pay for something, you're asking them to allocate money towards that report or towards that inspection, okay? And so it's really important to note here that it says about that, you're only determining who is to pay for the inspection, test, certificate, service, report mentioned. It does not determine who's to pay for any work recommended or identified in the report. Now, why is that? If you remember earlier that we talked about the properties are being sold as is unless otherwise agreed in writing. So that means any work that needs to be done on that home is part of a negotiation that has to be agreed to in writing, okay? And how do we do that? Well, as you can see here, we make agreements for payment on required work on forms RR, RRRR, ADM, which is the addendum, or AEA, which is our amendment of agreed upon existing terms, right? Amendment of existing terms. Okay, so moving forward, the next paragraph's got some nice stuff in here as well. I think this one's kind of important. I'm going to move it up here a little. Kind of important because, again, another pain point area where people argue as we get here to this section on reinspection fees. These two are kind of tied together here. So, as we know, when the home, if it has a loan and the appraiser comes in, they're checking for 3 big things, right? Carbon monoxide detectors, smoke detectors, water heater, double strapped, so it doesn't tip over in the case of an earthquake. So, any required installation of those items, okay, must now be completed within the time specified in paragraph 3 and 4. 3 and 4 is 7 days now, so the seller has 7 days to make sure the house is ready to go for the appraiser. And that's whether or not the seller is in charge of paying for those things, or even if the buyer says, I'll pay for that stuff to get done. If the buyer says he's going to pay for those items, the buyer, as instructed by the escrow holder, shall deposit funds into escrow or directly to the vendor who's completing that repair or that installation. Now, it says here as well, so it's still up to the buyer, okay? So it says here that it's still, no matter who's paying for it, the seller's obligation is to get that done in the time specified. And if the buyer incurs any cost to comply with the lender's requirements concerning those items, the seller shall be responsible for the buyer's costs. So how does that go with this paragraph here? Well, this is reinspection fees. So if any repair in paragraph 10b1, that's this one right here that we just talked about, is not completed within the time specified, and the lender requires an additional inspection to be made, the seller shall be responsible for any corresponding reinspection fee. If the buyer incurs any cost to comply with the lender requirements concerning those items, The seller shall be responsible for those costs. No longer an argument about that. Okay, so let's move on to the home warranty section here. Again, buyer shall choose the coverages regardless of any optional coverages indicated of the home warranty plan, and the buyer shall pay any cost of that plan chosen by the buyer that exceeds the amount allocated by the seller in paragraph 3Q18, right? The buyer is informed that the home warranty plans have many optional coverages, including but not limited to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the buyer is advised to investigate those coverages to see which ones may be suitable for that buyer. So I know there's a lot of arguments on sellers directing the home insurance companies, especially if you're putting seller's choice in there, but if you like a specific home warranty company over another, write it in the contract and be very clear with the agent on the other side. The seller is only allocating a cost, right? And it should be the buyer who's choosing what they want to purchase with that money. Okay, and then here, I love when they have language like this. If buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty and the home warranty plan in the paragraph, the buyer still may purchase a home warranty plan at the buyer's expense prior to the close of escrow. So it's still possible to get. So we're going to move forward to this next section, which is a little bit more in depth. Now we're really going to start talking about the seller's responsibilities, disclosures, which disclosures need to be delivered and how they need to be delivered. Okay, so one of the biggest transactional parts of the contract is making sure that the disclosures get delivered to the buyer by the seller in the first 7 days. So as you'll see in this paragraph here, we're talking about the TDS, the NHD, and the other statutory and supplemental disclosures. You'll see paragraph 3N1 referred to numerous times, and as we go on to the next page, you'll see it a couple more times. Paragraph 3N1, 7 days. That's the time that the seller shall have to deliver to buyer, unless exempt, fully completed disclosures required by Civil Code. This one here, those statutory disclosures include but are not limited to a real estate transfer disclosure statement, so that's the form TDS, a natural hazard disclosure statement, the NHD, and notice or actual knowledge of release of illegal controlled substances, notice of special tax and or assessments, and that would also include Melrose Community Facilities Act and the Bond Act of 1915. Okay, and then if the seller has actual knowledge of industrial use or military ordinance, and then if the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity area, then we would be putting out the fire hardening defensible space disclosure. That becomes now a statutory disclosure in those high and very high fire areas. Okay, so those are like the key big ones. So if you notice over here, they talk about SPQ and ESD, so we'll talk about those here a little bit. So when you agree to use a CAR form for the RPA, you are also agreeing that the seller is going to provide a seller property questionnaire. That's part of your agreement here in the contract. So it's not a statutory disclosure, but it's one that we all agree to use. So the other form, the ESD, that stands for exempt seller disclosure. So that is, a small fraction of the contracts that you'll actually do. Most contracts are going to require TDS, but you might have some situations like a bank-owned property or any property that is owned by a government agency that is then sold through like a court. Those would be TDS exempt. Another example are certain types of trusts. So I'll just talk about those real quick because that is another area of a lot of miscommunication and confusion. So I'm just going to use hypotheticals. Let's say that my parents own a home in a trust, right? Now, if they go to sell that home, they've lived in the home, so they have knowledge of the house. They would have to use a TDS. Now, let's say that that same house in my parents' trust, and I am the successor trustee, meaning if my parents pass away, then I step into line as the next trustee of that trust. So my parents get in a car accident and they're not with us anymore. Now I become the owner of the trust, or the trustee of the trust, which owns the home. And then now I go to sell it. I've never lived in the home. I don't have any knowledge of the home. So now I qualify to use the ESD, the exempt seller disclosure, and I do not have to provide a TDS. So that's like one of the times that you will see that pop up in your business a little bit more. Okay, so this next part here, we want to talk about what constitutes a fully delivered TDS. Okay, so if you read paragraph 11A2, the transfer disclosure statement required by this paragraph is considered fully completed if the seller has done the following things. First, they have to check the appropriate box in section 1. That's the section that talks about are there any other reports that supersede this TDS about that property, when, like, again, 99% of the time it's going to be no, there are no other reports. The seller must fill out all the questions and the section on what all the things that the house has, right? Whether it's on natural gas, propane, water, sprinklers, whether it has a pool, spa, all that kind of stuff. That's all section 2. And then the seller's agent, if any, has completed and signed the seller's agent section. This part's kind of important, section 3. Or if applicable, an agent visual inspection disclosure, right? In section 5, the acknowledgement of the receipt and a copy of the TDS shall be signed after all previous sections have been completed. So what's so important about this section right here? Right, and just about all of us are checking that box where we sign. There's 3 choices there. Choice number 1, seller has no other disclosures. Choice number 2, seller notes the following disclosures. Choice number 3, see attached AVID. They're not quite in that order. I think they're probably in the opposite order. But what's important about that is if you're checking that box that says see attached AVID, according to this paragraph here, the TDS is not fully completed unless you have that AVID filled out and sent with it. When you check that box, you are actually extending the TDS to include the agent visual inspection disclosure. And if you don't have it in there, you're not technically delivering the TDS, if that makes sense. And just a quick note on that, if it's checked and it says AVID to follow, I would strongly argue that would not make it delivered. So I would not be doing that, guys. The point here is if you're the listing agent, when you're getting your listing, and it's like the day that you're there for photographs, do your AVID, attach it to the TDS, deliver it on time. Moving on to the third paragraph here, again, like we talked about a little earlier, because you're doing a CAR form, your supplemental disclosures that we talk about here, seller shall, within the time specified in 3N1, which is the 7 days, provide supplemental disclosures as follows. Unless exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, complete a seller property questionnaire, CAR form SPQ. Okay, so that's where the SPQ comes into play. And then, of course, if you are exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, you'll complete an exempt seller disclosure, CAR form ESD. All right, so got that part taken care of. Let's see, we're going to move over to the next page, talking about the lead disclosure. And what's kind of important here is this date right here, right? And you'll see dates throughout the contract and throughout the forms. The big dates, January 1, 1978, that's lead. January 1, 1960, that's earthquake. And January 1, 2010 is home hardening. And why are those dates always January 1? And what does that signify? It typically means that there was a change to the building code the prior year that went into effect January 1 of the following year. So if you've heard anything about, lead disclosures, like the classic is chipping paint, right? You got chipping paint on your door jamb or something and little kids are peeling the paint off and chewing it, and if it was lead-based paint, they were getting sick. So, of course, in '78 they stopped making lead-based paint for home use, interior home use like that, and now the question then becomes, if the home's built before that, is the seller aware of any areas where there's lead exposed in that way? So it doesn't mean that if the wall had lead paint on it and it's been painted over 20 times since then, that's not a disclosure, it's not a hazard, like an active hazard. It's okay if the original paint 7 layers down is lead, but you still have to give them the disclosure, right, which is now called the Form LPD. It used to be the FLD, Federal Lead Paint Disclosure. Now they're calling it the Lead Paint Disclosure. And then you also have to give them the pamphlet, which can be found in a couple different spots. One, you can go into your zip forms and find it on your EPUBs, and sometimes it will be referenced in the NHD signature page and delivered electronically via a link. But you have to give that pamphlet when you have to give the lead disclosure. Okay, we'll move on to the really kind of difficult one, which is going to be the home hardening and the defensible space. Now, the reason why I say that together is the form FHDS is the fire hardening defensible space, but we've got 2 different paragraphs here, but so it's still kind of one form. So the key note to both of these is the house in a high or very high fire zone? And if the answer is yes, the house is in a high or very high fire zone, then the defensible space disclosure becomes effective. Okay, and this one here is tricky because what this basically means is the fire board, or the state fire board, wants to make sure that your house is safe from too much greenery, vegetation, and shrubs right up on the house. Wildfire breaks out and your house is harder to defend, correct? So defensible space. So on the form, there are 4 options, and one of those 4 has to be checked as part of the disclosure. So they are broken up into 2 groups. There's 2 answers for the group that is when your house is in an area with no local ordinance, and then there's 2 answers for the group that is for where your house is where there is a local ordinance. Well, what does that mean? Well, so CAL FIRE is the state agency that kind of controls and regulates all this defensible space stuff. Most of the entire state is governed by CAL FIRE's rules. There are some municipalities and areas where there is a local ordinance that is more restrictive than CAL FIRE, where they want things done their way, in a way that is more restrictive than CAL FIRE. So I'm not aware at this time of us being in any of those areas down here in our Southern California area. I've heard most of those areas are up north, but again, please check to make sure your area does not have a local ordinance. So based on the fact that we don't have a local ordinance, 2 of those options we don't deal with. We're only dealing with the 2 options that are in the no local ordinance zone. Option number 1 is that the buyer assumes the responsibility to call the fire agency and have the property assessed and a certificate given for defensible space. That is going to be 99% of your transactions. The other very few transactional possibilities are going to be, and it states, if the seller within the last 6 months has already had a state agency come to his house, assess and certify his property for being defensible space, then that certificate needs to be given to the buyer as part of the disclosure package in the first 7 days. So I don't know a lot of people that have gone out of their way on their own yet to have the fire authority come to their home, assess their property, and give them a certificate that says they're in compliance with defensible space rules. So again, by default, 99% of our transactions are going to fall in the realm where the buyer within the first 12 months is assuming the responsibility of calling and having that done. Now, what I've been told by CAR Legal is that all the responsibility is at this point in time is they have to pick up the phone, call the state agency, ask for them to come down, and if the state agency says we don't have the manpower to do it or we can't do it right now, then the buyer has fulfilled their obligation to try to get that done within the first year. Okay, and then of course, I'm sure as time goes on, every time that house is resold, there's going to either be, another that buyer is going to either have to assume that within that 12 months, or the seller will have, if it's somebody who does get a hold of an agency, then you're going to start seeing more reports done in the last 6 months being delivered. Okay, so let's go back up here to the fire hardening. So what is fire hardening? So fire hardening has to do with the materials that are used to build a home. And, materials are constantly changing. We just had a new building code January 1, 2020, which was, all the things that they decided to add in 2019, the biggest one being solar. So again, we're always updating the building code. This one here was to make sure that we were stopped using flammable materials on the roof of houses, on the sides of houses, the siding, in the gutters, gutter covers, different things like that. So if the home is in a high or very high fire area, again, that's always the number one determining factor, and the home was built before January 1st, 2010, then the seller is responsible for filling out the fire hardening disclosure. And it's a series of, I think, 5 questions about the materials of the house, what the house is made out of. Okay, so if the home was built after January 1, 2010, then the fire hardening disclosure could become an optional fire hardening advisory. Okay, so you still can use it if you want to, but it no longer becomes one of the main statutory disclosures. Okay, so lot going on in this paragraph, guys. Lot going on. I'm going to skip this section here for just a moment because we're going to go down and continue to talk about some of the other things that the buyer can investigate, and some of the other responsibilities during that this period of time where we're getting all the information about the house. So this version of the RPA, the withholding taxes, the FERPTA stuff, whether you were using the affidavit of the seller's non-foreign status or you were using the QS, the qualified substitute, this used to be due in the first 7 days. And now it has, you'll notice that paragraph 3 in 1 is not referenced here, and it now says that this has to be delivered, okay, by the close of escrow, prior to the close of escrow. So this kind of takes off some of the pressure of us having to get it done, because typically escrow will do this when people are signing their docs or signing their instructions and they're filling out their statement of information, their buyer or seller information sheet, the seller information sheet. They're going to get all this stuff now, and you'll know, the buyer will know whether or not money needs to be set aside for, or the seller will know, whether money is going to be set aside. But we'll go to Megan's Law database. And for those of you who don't know, Megan's Law database is the database that lets people know where convicted sex offenders, once they've been released, or whether they've been incarcerated or not, but if they're convicted and they're moving into your neighborhood, they have to register with this site. And you can go to this website, and it's clearly stated here on the contract. So that's why it's really not a deliverable, right? The seller doesn't have to deliver to buyer like the list, like here's the list of all the people that live in the area. It's letting you know that the buyer has the opportunity to go to the website. But again, that is also with the transmission pipeline, which is the same kind of thing. There could be hazardous liquid transmission pipelines or high-powered gas pipelines like we have here in Tehachapi. You can go to this website and it'll show you a map of where they are. Now, both of these things are valid reasons for a buyer to cancel within that first 17 days, right? They take a look at that and they notice there's somebody across the street, or they notice that the gas pipeline's too close to the house, too close for comfort, right? They can cancel based on either one of these. Okay, moving on to other things that we look at. Condominium and plan development disclosures, right? This is all HOA docs kind of stuff. Well, what it says now is the seller, within the time specified in paragraph 3N3, which is 3 days. Okay, so the first 3 days of the contract, actually the first 3 business days, the buyer is putting the EMD in, and the seller is paying the fee necessary to the HOA or the POA or whatever owners association to start the process of preparing the documents so that the buyer can review them. And what are we looking for? Well, the buyer has the opportunity to look at, let's see, any of the documents required by law. So these are going to be disclosure of any pending or anticipated claim or litigation by or against the HOA. Excuse me, a statement containing the location and number of designated parking and storage spaces, copies of the most recent 12 months of HOA minutes for regular and special meetings, the names and contact information of all HOAs governing the property, pet restrictions, smoking restrictions, and let's see, that's pretty much it right there. So essentially, and I think the older version of the contract used to say that you had to deliver the financials as well. So I don't know on this one here what I don't see financials per se, but whether or not that's going to be considered in the meeting minutes. But essentially, the buyer has the right to see the strength, the restrictive level, and whether or not financially stable the HOA is before they buy into it. Correct? Because it would be horrible if you buy into an HOA and they're poorly managed, and then all of a sudden your HOA fee is not being spent correctly. Okay, let's go on to the next, natural and environmental hazards. Again, seller shall, within the time specified in 3N1, which is 7 days, if required by law, deliver to the buyer the earthquake guide and environmental hazards booklet, and for all residential properties 1 through 4, any do that for any, for all, those residential property 1 through 4, manufactured or mobile home built before January 1, 1960. Okay, again, building code change, January 1, 1960. Houses before that, you fill out the you fill out the earthquake guide, which is the one that has the questions. Everybody always wants to know what a cripple wall is, but the one with all the boxes, cripple wall, is your house built on a hillside? Do you have a living space above the garage? Is there any unreinforced masonry walls? So on and so forth. Anything for a house before 1960. Okay. And then one here, a little bit more ambiguous. I'm not quite sure exactly what it means, right? Well, let's talk about it. Known material facts. So the question, what is a material fact? What is a material fact and defect? So material fact and defect is something that affects the value and desirability of the home. So I would suggest that when you're doing your AVIDs, those are the types of things that you're looking for. Okay, things that are going to affect the desirability and the value of the home. So when I see things that say like there's a nail hole in the wall, or there's a cracked switch plate on the light switch, those things really aren't affecting desirability or value. Now, if there's clear and obvious structural issue with the house, one of the big cases that happened back in the 70s, that was one of the real big catalysts for the AVIDs and the seller's responsibility, was the house was falling off the side of a hill. And it was clear that the seller knew about it because there was all kinds of retaining implements on the hillside trying to hold it up. And the agents should have been able to clearly see it. So those are the things that we're looking for, known material facts and defects. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff. So if there's anything that the seller is aware of, has to be disclosed, can't hide stuff. Any items affecting the property but not limited to known insurance claims within the past 5 years, and provide buyer with permission to contact the lender to get such information, et cetera, right there. Okay, but why are insurance claims so big? Well, because usually insurance claims are some kind of catastrophic damage, and it can spur another investigation, right? I want to see the results, what was done to the house. I had one once where the water heater exploded, and there was an insurance claim, which then prompted the buyer to have a mold inspection to make sure that there was no leftover moisture in the walls. It also prompted them to check with the building department to see when the water heater was put back in, did they do it with a permit? Was there a remediation company that came in and cleaned up all the water? So that's sometimes, by knowing this kind of stuff, you can ignite more investigation on the buyer's behalf. The more, remember guys, the more that the buyer knows about the house, the safer the seller is that there's not going to be litigation down the road. So now that we've talked about some of the things the seller has to do, let's talk about what the buyer can do during their investigation period. So the buyer shall have, within the time specified in paragraph 3L3, which defaults at 17 days, unless you change that, have the right at the buyer's expense, unless otherwise agreed, to conduct investigations, inspections, tests, surveys, and other studies, known as buyer investigations. Buyer investigations include, but are not limited to, inspections regarding any physical attributes of the property or items connected to the property, such as a general home inspection, an inspection for lead-based paint and other lead-based paint hazards, an inspection specifically for wood-destroying pests and organisms. Okay, what's important to know here is that this section here, paragraph C, without the seller's prior written consent, the buyer shall neither make nor cause to be made invasive or instructive buyer investigations, except for minimally invasive testing required to prepare a pest control report, which shall not include any holes or drilling through stucco or similar material. So what kind of minimally invasive testing? Well, if you've ever seen the pest inspector walk around with what looks like a ski pole and they're poking at the fascia boards, sometimes there's dry rot and that stick goes right through and it creates what would be considered a minimally invasive hole or testing or small damage, but nothing major, right? Unless you have the seller's consent. So if there's the thought that maybe there's water behind the wall, you can't just come and cut the wall out without talking about that with the seller first. The seller shall make the property available for all buyer investigations. The seller is not obligated to move any existing personal property. Here's a really cool sentence right here. We're in D right now. The seller shall have the water, the gas, the electricity, and all operable pilot lights on for the buyer's investigations and through the date possession is delivered to the buyer. How many times have we argued over who's going to put the water back on? The seller vacated, right? The house is vacant. They've lived in a different state, and now you're in escrow and you want to go do your home inspection, and there's an argument over who's going to pay to turn things back on. That's the seller. Or, you get close to the close of escrow, and the seller agent calls and says, well, you better have your buyer put the accounts in their names because my client's already shut it all off. You're like, nope, can't do that. So what would happen in that case? So the buyer gets everything turned back on, and there's a bill for that, and before the close of escrow, and then you send that bill to escrow, and guess whose proceeds it comes out of? Yeah, not ours, right? It goes to the seller. So really important right there on that part. There is section E right here, buyer indemnity and seller protection for entry upon the property. Buyer shall keep the property free and clear of liens. So nothing that the buyer does during the inspection should put a lien on the property, meaning if there's some kind of report or some kind of inspection and they don't pay, the service provider could lien the property, right? Well, that's not going to happen, right? Because the buyer is saying that they have to keep it free and clear of liens. Repair all damage arising from the buyer investigation, and indemnify and hold the seller harmless from all resulting liability claims, demands, damages, and costs. The buyer shall carry or the buyer shall require anyone acting on the buyer's behalf to carry policies of liability, workers' compensation, and or other applicable insurance. So that right there just tells you that your cousin or your uncle who is just a handyman should not be doing your home inspections. Okay, make sure that your home inspectors, your roofers, your plumber, anybody coming in to do inspections on the property should be carrying some type of insurance policy, protect against liability, workers' compensation, or whatever type of insurance to protect the seller from liability for any injuries to persons or property that occur during the buyer's investigations or any work done on the property at the buyer's direction prior to the close of escrow. Okay, so now we're on page 10 of the contract, paragraph 14, talking about time periods, the removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. This is the part where we get into the really transactional stuff and like a lot of arguments here on, who's going to remove the contingency, did I get what I was supposed to get, all that kind of stuff really starts to take place in here. So this part I'm going to spend a lot of time on. One of the things I see a lot of people struggling with is removal of contingencies, notices to perform, rights to cancel. We talk about that stuff all the time. Okay, so let's talk about up here at the top. We're going to go with paragraph 14A, the seller delivery of documents. Okay, the seller shall, within the time specified in 3N1, which is 7 days, like we've been talking about this whole time, deliver to buyer all reports, disclosures, and information known as reports for which the seller is responsible in all the preceding paragraphs, 9B6, 10, 11A, 11B, 11C, 11D, 11H, 11K, 11L, 11M, 13A, and 13D. So all those disclosures that we just talked about, plus any reports. So what would be reports like pest inspection report, septic report, roof report, HOA docs, TDS, SPQ, all that stuff that has to be delivered in 7 days, right, comes over. And then the buyer has the time specified in paragraph 3, which is 17 days to perform investigations. That's what we just talked about. Review all the disclosures, reports, lease documents, right? Anything for leases like a water softener lease, solar lease, alarm lease, propane tank lease, any of those types of leases. And then let's see, those are the leases that are to be assumed by the buyer and any other information which buyer receives from the seller. Approve all matters affecting of the property and deliver seller signed copies of the statutory and other disclosures delivered by the seller in accordance with paragraph 11. Okay, then the buyer, within the time specified in 3L3, again 17 days, requests that the seller make repairs or take any other action regarding the property on form RR. Now this is really important part of this paragraph right here. So again, you have 17 days to request the seller make repairs or take actions on form RR. It says right here clearly, seller has no obligation to agree or respond to the buyer's requests. Okay? If the seller does not agree or does not respond, the buyer is not contractually entitled to have the repairs or other requests made and may only cancel based on contingencies in this agreement. This kind of goes back to the houses being sold as is, unless otherwise agreed in writing. So what I sometimes see is the seller doesn't respond. The agent goes, well, the buyer's agent, well, they're not responding, and I've reached out to them multiple times, don't know what to do, and we get stuck in this limbo period. So one of the ways that you can do this, well, what I see people trying to do is to send a notice to perform to the seller to respond to the RR. But later, as we talk about notice to performs in a different video, you'll see that notice to performs can only be used for contractual actions and for contingency removals. Contractual actions would be things like getting your earnest money deposit into the bank in 3 business days. That's a contractual action that you've agreed upon, so you can use a notice to perform for that. But this is not a contractual obligation because the seller has no obligation to agree to an RR, so using a notice to perform would not be Correct. So what would be the appropriate action if the buyer doesn't want to buy the house unless all these repairs are done and you're not getting your response back? Unfortunately, it's cancellation of the contract. Okay, so you can have that conversation with the agent on the other side. Hey, you guys haven't responded. You've left us no choice to cancel. Is that what you really want to do, or did you just fall asleep on the job, right? And he goes, hey, they're not going to make any repairs. So then you have a conversation with your buyer. They're not making any repairs. Are we going forward? Are we taking the house as is, as the contract states, or are we canceling out of this contract? So that's the real important takeaway from that one right there. The other things to talk about are higher up here in paragraph 14. So we talk about the removal of contingencies in cancellation under this paragraph, right? Whether the buyer's investigation and time periods. It does say here that the following time periods may only be extended, altered, or modified or changed by mutual written agreement. Any removal of contingencies or cancellation under this paragraph by either the buyer or seller must be exercised in good faith and in writing. So you either remove the contingency with a CR, contingency removal, or you cancel it with the CC, cancellation of contract. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about time periods and extended, altered, modified, etc., etc. Okay, so in California, California is known as a active contingency removal state. The other kind of contingency removal in other states is what's called passive, right? Passive simply means that when the 17 days are up, it just dissolves, it goes away, the contingency is no longer there, it just automatically goes away. In California, as an active state, as the 17 days approaches, the seller has to enforce that date. And they enforce that date by sending a notice to perform, which sounds really kind of scary. The notice to perform on it clearly states that it can be delivered 2 days prior to the expiration of the contingency that you're trying to remove. And it says to the buyer, if you do not remove this contingency when it's due on the 17th, so let's use 17 days, right? So we give it on the 15th day. If you don't remove it in 48 hours, which is the end of the 17th day, then you are now in breach of contract, and then the seller who's enforcing the contract now has the right to cancel the contract based upon your inability to move on this notice to perform. Now, a couple of things here. It's a great tool to move the contract along, but know that if you're the seller, on the seller side, the seller's agent, that the only way that really has a lot of teeth into it is if you're willing to absorb the consequence that comes with enforcing the contract, which is a cancellation. So if you have a seller who really does not want to cancel this contract, then sending notices to perform and demanding that contingencies are removed can become very frustrating, right? Because if the buyer knows there's not a backup offer and you really want to sell this house to that buyer, the buyer can just kind of string you along, which is really unfortunate, but that's kind of the way it is. Okay, the buyer shall, by the end of the time specified in paragraph 3L, deliver to seller the removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement. However, if any report, disclosure, or information for which the seller is responsible, other than those in paragraph 11A or 11B, is not delivered within the time specified in paragraph 3N1, the 7 days, then the buyer has 5 days after the delivery of such item or the time specified in paragraph 3L, whichever is later. 3L is 17 days, guys. Which means if at the end of 7 days you didn't get what you were supposed to get, but they gave it to the 9th day, 5 days later is the 14th day, so you would still go to paragraph 3L, which is 17 days, right? But if they were supposed to deliver it to you on the 7th day and they don't give it to you until the 16th day, now you have till the 21st day instead of the 17th day. Okay. If that makes sense, I apologize. If the delivery of any report occurs after a contractual contingency pertaining to that report has already been waived or removed, The delivery of the report does not revive the contingency, but there may be a right to terminate for a subsequent or amended disclosure under paragraph 11G. Okay, so what they're basically saying there is, in most circumstances, once a contingency has been removed, there is no contingency to put back in place. As I once had a car attorney tell me when I was arguing this point with him, when I said, so we've removed the contingency and then this came out, does the contingency come back on? And he goes, what contingency? And I go, well, the one for the inspection, but it's already been removed. Yes, I understand, sir, but does it come back? What contingency? It's gone, it's gone. Once it's gone, okay? So that's kind of what they're talking about right there.